Welcome back to The Point and a special episode looking back on Nehru's legacy as Prime Minister of India. Swapan Das Gupta, let's come to those two areas that we mentioned right at the end of part one, and let's begin with Kashmir. Nehru faces criticism for taking the Kashmir dispute to the UN and also for committing India to a plebiscite which in fact never happened. As you view Nehru, do you believe that those two were unforgivable mistakes or were they understandable at the time?
No, they were certainly not understandable. They were a gesture of misplaced magnanimity. And when you're dealing with such a brutal issue as partition, I think Nehru had to take into account that what is it you want for India? Do you want India to regain as much, to maintain as much of the united India that existed prior to 1947, or are you happy with as much of a truncated India as you can possibly get? So these were the choices. To my mind, Nehru actually prevaricated. He should have seized the opportunity, just as used the methodology of Junagadh and Hyderabad in Kashmir, when you had the paper called the Instrument of Accession in your hand. And secondly, I think worse is that once, okay, there would be bound to be a certain retaliation from the Pakistani side, which you had to cope with militarily and diplomatically. But to put it in the hands of a multilateral body like the United Nations, over whose decisions you had no control, and where the odds were really weighed against you, I think, to my mind, was a colossal error of judgment.
Okay.
And stemmed, again, from this naive belief that really politics, statesmanship, etc., are all born out of gentlemanly agreements or disagreements. And at the end of the day, if the UN decides, well, Kashmir should ideally go to Pakistan, you can hand it over on a platter. It's a legacy for which we are suffering. Okay. But I guess we had an opportunity again during Simla Accord, but we need not go into that later for the moment. But yes, I think it certainly betrayed Nehru's naivete. Whether that was also manifested in the over-reliance on Krishna Menon, or believing that Tibet constituted a very benign expression of Chinese reconquest. It was part of that mindset.
Okay. Gopal Gandhi, Article 370 was put into India's constitution on Sheikh Abdullah's insistence and certainly with Nehru's complete willingness to accept it. Now, in your eyes, is Article 370 another Nehruvian mistake, as many today believe, or do you believe Article 370 was the glue that gave Kashmir the reassurance to accept accession and therefore critical and necessary? Which of the two?
Well, the Article 370 is not the creation of one man. That one man is not Jawaharlal Nehru. It was the creation of a common assessment of the situation. And it has, I think, served us well. It has also created very great problems. But by and large, if you were to look at it in the tapestry of history, you would know that this is a very unique Indian response to a very strange and complicated situation. I do not believe that we should judge the working of the Article 370 from the perspective of what has happened in very recent years. We should look at its intention.
Okay.
We should look at what it tried to seek to do. And if we see it that way, we will realize that it was an extraordinary provision to meet an extraordinary situation.
Mushrur Hassan, in 1953, Nehru dismissed Sheikh Abdullah, arrested him and kept him in detention right up till 1964. That one act diminished, if not discredited, the Indian promise of democracy to the Kashmiris. Now, thereafter, unfortunately, things only got worse from the Kashmiri standpoint. Was this another mistake by Nehru?
I think it was. I think it was. I think, and here too, as in the case of China, where I think he was ill-advised by Krishna Menon, In the case of Sheikh Abdullah's detention or arrest, I think his advisors did not serve him well. I think he had very little idea of Sheikh Abdullah's popularity in the valley, enormous support that he had, and very little idea of what the arrest might lead to. And eventually it led to unrest, very widespread unrest in the valley. So I think there was probably again an error of judgment, and I think Nehru in his letters in 57, 58 does express regret at the fact that he had to take this step and do this to a very old friend. They were very good friends.
Absolutely.
They worked together. But I do want to, just for a second, I do want to say that Junagadh and Hyderabad cannot be compared with Kashmir. Kashmir is very special. Kashmir's accession is very special, because I do no time to go into the details. So therefore, Nehru's sort of
response had to be different.
Had to be very different.
That's a very fair point. And in
yeah.
fact, the point you're making is that for 3 months, technically,
That's right.
after August, Kashmir was in fact almost an independent country, having got a standstill agreement with both,
country.
which is why it differs from Junagadh and Hyderabad. Shaukatul Roy, it's interesting that when we talk about Kashmir, we're identifying, I beg your pardon, Shaukatul Bose, my apologies, sir. We are identifying a series of judgments of error by Nehru, taking the matter to the UN, promising a plebiscite which was never fulfilled, and then finally the arrest of Sheikh Abdullah. Why is it that Nehru was so prone to judgments of error when it came to Kashmir?
Well, he had a certain obsession with Kashmir. I once described Nehru as a majestic man prone to committing Himalayan blunders. But I wouldn't say that his commitment to a plebiscite or taking the Kashmir issue to the United Nations was the crowning blunder. I think the Delhi agreement that he forged with Sheikh Abdullah in 1952 was a good one, and he ought to have stuck to it. And it was the elements of that agreement that got worked into Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. But we cannot blame his advisors for the decision that he took to incarcerate Sheikh Abdullah for the next decade. And he also whittled down the provisions of autonomy in Article 370 in his lifetime during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He did make a very late attempt in 1964 to put matters right just before his death. He released Abdullah, but that was too late. I think that while recognizing that Nehru was on balance a great democrat, we also have to understand that he wasn't as respectful of federalism as he might have been. I think he mishandled Nagaland as well in 1956. He did acquiesce in the overthrow of the duly elected government in Kerala in 1959, even though it was his daughter, Indira Gandhi, who was president of the Congress at that time. So I think he had difficulty in acknowledging that genuine Indian unity can only be of a federal type, and nowhere more so than in the case of Kashmir's relationship with the rest of India. So that was, I think, sort of a blemish in Nehru's illustrious career.
Now, Gopal Gandhi, let's come to that second area where today, at least contemporaries of our time, believe Nehru failed, and that's the economy. He's often accused by people of gifting India what's called the 3% Hindu rate of growth. Did the mixed economy which Nehru championed throttle enterprise? Or is it the reason why India was able to boast of big dams and major steel plants that Nehru in his time used to call the temples of modern democracy, modern India?
So that question will be answered by people according to their positions and predispositions. I would like to hazard one. There would have been nothing to privatize today had Nehru not ushered in mixed economy, had Nehru not asked the state, the Indian state, to take the commanding heights of the Indian economy. There would have been nothing today to privatize. There is no doubt that that system led to what was famously called by his democratic opponent Rajagopalachari as the permit license quota Raj. But there is also this to be acknowledged, that were it not for those steps taken by the new government of India to wrest control over the resources of India and perhaps prevent their very early snapping up by technocratic private capital, we would have been in a very sorry pass today.
Swapan Dasgupta, was Nehru unjustifiably suspicious and perhaps also distrusting of private enterprise? Apparently, he once told J.R.D. Tata, profit, he said, is a dirty word. Was Nehru a prisoner of 1920s Fabian socialism at a time and in an age when perhaps he should have been emulating South Korea, boosting exports, growing the GDP so that he could pull millions out of poverty?
You know, statism, particularly of the Fabian variety, was really the fashion of the day, particularly in Britain. And Nehru was greatly influenced after the Labour's victory in 1945. And he saw that as the model, the one that the state will have the most efficient way of distributing resources, managing resources. It was based on contemporary fashion. And I must say that in that sense, Nehru was by no means the only person of his time who did what he did. The problem really arose not that the state would have some role or even a large role in capital formation in India, in building certain infrastructure projects, but that he created an environment which was later taken to its ridiculous culmination by his daughter, Indira Gandhi, whereby the role of private capital was consciously disavowed. I think Nehru had an aesthetic repugnance of what he saw as the Lala, the Baniya. And I think it comes out in some ways by the fact that those who were seen to be the more traditional Congress leaders, including Sardar Patel, including Rajaji, including Dr. B.C. Roy at that time, were seen to be in cohorts with Indian capital, and he didn't like that. And he would rather go and create an alternative, enlightened, statist bureaucracy which would have no organic links with capital, and they would be his technocrats to be able to do it. Now, that was a vision. Ultimately, that vision, to my mind, led to India underperforming in terms of its potential.
Okay. Swapan says Nehru's vision led to India underperforming in terms of its potential. On the other hand, Nehru gave India Bhakra Nangal, atomic energy, a commitment to science and technology, and firmly put the country on the road to modernization. How much credit do you give him for all of that?
Enormous. I think we must first of all keep in mind the fact that Nehru was simply following or implementing the decisions that the Congress had already taken in the past, starting with the Karachi Resolution of 1931. So it's not something that has come up all of a sudden after 1947.
He was following Congress policy.
So he was following Congress policies, whether it was this or whether it was federalism or it was the abolition of zamindari, which took place in 1952. So that's one. The other point that I would like to make is that we must keep in mind the scale of poverty and impoverishment in this country. India was truly a backward country. And under the circumstances, there were no easy solutions to problems of poverty and backwardness. And under the circumstances, the idea of a mixed economy was a very sound one.
Because it was an accurate response to the challenge of poverty, which is greater than what we realize today.
Well, absolutely, absolutely.
Let's come, in the limited time available to us, Professor Bose, to Nehru the person. At a time when perhaps it was forgivable, maybe at least understandable for people to be sectarian and communal in the aftermath of partition, Nehru was perhaps India's most secular politician. Today, when we preach rather than practice secularism, how much credit do you give him for his unquestioned commitment to it? Or do you sometimes think there's some truth to the BJP criticism that in Nehru's secularism was a very substantial anti-Hindu element?
I think there was no anti-Hindu element in Nehru's secularism at all. If I may, I just wanted to also add that in terms of economic policy, I don't think it was, Nehru's socialism became a stifling form of statism, but that is not what I would criticize him for. He was a secularist and a socialist. Now, as a socialist, what I would fault him for is not actually concentrating on primary education and primary health. He built our scientific establishments, he built us a heavy industrial base. We are grateful to him for that. But he had promised 100% literacy in 10 years in 1947, and he wasn't even halfway towards that goal. But as a person, as you pointed out, he, I think, did not have even an iota of bigotry or prejudice in him. And that is something, a personal quality, that I think the younger generation in India ought to emulate today. And if I may add a personal anecdote, I only saw Nehru in person once as a 4-year-old when he came to visit the newly established Netaji Museum in Kolkata. Now, I don't think I have any memory of it, but I have been told by my parents, and I see pictures, I was completely charmed by him. He clearly had a magic touch with children.
Okay.
And he was able to just win over people with an expression of love, of affection, and a clear sense that he regarded every human being, whatever his or her social background, as equal.
You know, Mr. Gandhi, in the middle of that answer, Professor Bose almost stole the question I want to put to you, and it was the fact that there's a certain contradiction in Nehru's personality. He was perhaps our best educated, certainly our best read Prime Minister. He went out of his way to write those famous letters to educate his daughter. And yet when it came to primary and secondary education for the country he ruled, it seemed to lose priority. IITs and IIMs got a lot of importance, but primary and secondary education didn't. How do you explain that contradiction?
I'm very glad you asked this question, Karan. He was basically a teacher. There was something very professorial about him at one level, but also very much of a parental teacher. This is evident not just from his letters to his daughter, but also in the way he spoke to people in India. He spoke to different communities.
But what about the contradiction I'm pointing out? The contradiction I'm pointing out sits very ill with someone who you call a teacher. He forgot to teach the country.
I would not agree with you there at all. I do not think he forgot to teach the country anything. I think he probably forgot to express to his own party some of the tenets of the Congress's freedom struggles ideas, and allowed his party to drift into a kind of servile.
We're talking, I'm afraid, of different types of teaching.
That was, I think, his greatest failure as a teacher. Teaching his colleagues in his party was not his strong point, not his achievement.
You may well be right that he failed to teach his party. Let me very quickly bring in Professor Hassan, because he is in fact the only academic other than Professor Bose who's here with us. Do you think Nehru failed to pay enough attention to primary education? No. IIMTs and IIMs, but not primary education?
I don't think so. In fact, it's completely untrue, because all the later day schemes that developed in the 60s and the 70s after Nehru's death owed their origin to Nehru. We must not forget the fact that at a time in 1947 there was a big debate whether we have to restrict higher education to certain, with people of quote unquote aptitude. Nehru was the one who said no, we must open it to all.
But did he do enough to educate people in terms of the 3 R's?
Yes.
He did.
The primary centers, primary schools and secondary schools were set up under the government patronage. But given the size of the country, and given the fact that the illiteracy levels were so very high, Nehru could not have possibly achieved his goals in 17 years' time.
Swapan Das Gupta, I'm going to give you the last word. Try and give me, Swapan Das Gupta, an overall verdict of Nehru. Non-alignment, the economy, China, as well as democracy, as well as failure to do enough for primary education. Give me a final verdict on the man, a quick one.
Nehru was a stylish man. Nehru was an aesthete. Nehru was a cosmopolitan. He was a man of ideas. Certainly, he was a patrician. I think his biggest failure was that he was insufficiently attentive to some of the more deeper roots that bound India together. And he wanted to almost interpret India in the manner in which he chose. He thought India was a plasticine bowl which could be molded in any way he wanted. And that, unfortunately, did not happen for him. I think, in the end, he succeeded. He was admired because of India, but his failures were also because of India. He was not, at the end of the day, a rooted politician.
Okay.
He was a thinking politician. He was a professorial politician. And I think today, if we look back and he was more a poet who was trying to actually sing a song of his choice to India.
All right.
India accepted some verses, rejected others.
Nobody was more rooted in the soil than Jawaharlal Nehru.
All right, we've got two contrary views as our last verdict. No one was more rooted, says Professor Hassan. Nehru wasn't rooted enough, says Swapna Dasgupta. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Let those two be the poles on which, in fact, this discussion has veered for much of the time. Nehru was clearly a man that fascinates us. He was clearly a prime minister to whom we owe a lot. But he's also a prime minister for whom many believe there is a lot of blame that he must accept. That, of course, makes a man richer. It makes a man more interesting and fascinating. In many ways, it makes him relevant to us because India is, as you know, an argumentative country. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. Have a fantastic weekend. See you on Monday.